There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They come wrapped in the mundane fabric of a Tuesday night, smelling of microwaved popcorn and the faint, clean scent of laundry detergent. They don't announce themselves with trumpets or a roll of thunder. They slip in through a door you left unlocked, settle onto your couch, and wait for the movie you're only half watching to reach a lull. They lean a little closer in the dim, flickering light, and they ask a question that has the power to either build a world or burn one to the ground. You don't recognize these moments as pivotal until much later, when you're looking back at the map of your life, and you see a single point from which all roads diverged. For me, that moment had a name, and it was Julian. And the question was quiet, almost a whisper, lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. We were on the sofa, a familiar geography of cushions and worn-out blankets that had become the landscape of our evenings. A forgettable action movie was playing, all muted explosions and tinny dialogue, serving as little more than ambient noise to fill the space our own words did not. His head was resting on my shoulder, a weight I had grown so accustomed to it felt like a phantom limb when it was gone. His arm was draped across my stomach, his fingers loosely curled against my side. This was our ritual, an unspoken agreement forged in the crucible of his recent heartbreak, a nightly tableau of platonic intimacy that felt anything but platonic to me. The air was thick with things unsaid, a silence so dense it seemed to have its own gravity, pulling me deeper into the orbit of his casual, devastating proximity. He shifted, the slight movement sending a cascade of warmth through my shirt. The scent of his shampoo, a mix of sandalwood and something uniquely him, was a constant, gentle assault on my carefully constructed defenses. He tilted his head, his breath ghosting against the column of my throat. The movie faded into an irrelevant hum. The world narrowed to this single point of contact, this shared space on a worn leather couch. Then, his voice, low and rough around the edges. "Leo," I hummed a response, afraid that any word I tried to form would fracture and betray the storm raging inside my chest. My entire being was focused on the simple, impossible task of breathing normally. He was quiet for another long moment, and I could feel the tension coiling in him, a subtle tightening of the muscles in the arms slung across my body. I braced myself. I thought he was going to get up, announce he was tired, and retreat to the sanctuary of my bed, where we would later perform the same careful ballet of feigned sleep and accidental closeness. I thought the moment would pass, as it always did, leaving me alone with the ghost of his warmth and the bitter taste of my own cowardice. But he didn't move. "What would you do if I kissed you right now?" The question landed not like a bomb, but like a single, perfect snowflake on a still lake, its impact silent but radiating outwards, changing the entire composition of the surface. It was hypothetical. It was a game. It was a line from a movie far better than the one we were ignoring. But it was also deadly serious. My heart didn't just beat. It slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The careful architecture of my composure, built over years of silent affection and disciplined friendship, crumbled to dust. In the dark room of my mind, a single, high-wattage bulb flickered on, illuminating every corner of my terrified, hopeful soul. This was the door I had always been afraid to approach, and he had just casually knocked on it. I had a choice. I could pretend I didn't hear. I could laugh it off, a clumsy, self-deprecating joke to deflect the terrifying sincerity of it all. Or I could answer him. I could tell him the truth. I told him. So he did. But to understand the weight of that kiss, the sheer tectonic shift it represented, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. You have to understand the years of silence that preceded it. Julian and I were a study in contrasts, an unlikely pairing that made sense to no one but us. We met in college, thrown together by a shared introductory statistics class that we both equally despised. I was a quiet observer, a photography student who saw the world as a series of potential frames, most comfortable behind a lens where I could capture life without having to fully participate in it. My world was one of darkrooms, the sharp chemical scent of developer fluid, and the patient, solitary act of waiting for an image to emerge from the ether. I moved through the world quietly, trying not to disturb the composition. Julian, on the other hand, didn't just move through the world. He crashed through it like a tidal wave. He was the star of the university swim team, a creature of kinetic energy and effortless charisma. He was loud laughter in the dining hall, the flash of a broad smile across the quad, the embodiment of a golden, sun-drenched vitality that seemed almost mythical to me. His element was water, a medium of pure force and fluid grace, while mine was silver halide, a medium of captured light and preserved memory. Where I was stillness, he was motion. Where I was shadow, he was a blinding point of light. He was everything I was not, and from the moment I saw him, I was utterly, irrevocably captivated. Our friendship shouldn't have worked. We orbited different suns, spoke different social languages. But that statistics class became our unlikely bridge. I was good at it. The numbers and probabilities were a logical system I could understand, a comforting set of rules in a chaotic world. He was, to put it mildly, not. He'd sit beside me, radiating a frantic energy, running a hand through his perpetually damp, chlorine-scented hair, and stare at the professor's equations as if they were written in an ancient, unknowable script. One afternoon, he turned to me, his blue eyes, the color of the deep end of the pool, wide with a kind of desperate appeal. "I have no idea what's happening," he'd confessed, his voice a low rumble. "If I fail this, I'm off the team. Can you help me?" It was the first time he had truly seen me, not as part of the classroom's general scenery, but as an individual. I felt like one of my own photographs, suddenly brought into sharp focus. My heart did a slow, painful lurch. I, the boy who preferred the company of chemicals and paper, was being asked to tether this force of nature. "Yes," I'd said, my own voice sounding thin and distant to my ears. Of course. That was the beginning. Our study sessions became a fixture. We'd meet in the library, his sprawling, athletic frame looking comically out of place amongst the dusty stacks. He'd try to focus, he really would, but his energy couldn't be contained by the library's enforced silence for long. He'd tap his pen, bounce his knee, and his attention would drift until I'd gently call his name and pull him back to the task at hand. I learned the rhythm of his mind, the way he needed concepts explained not with abstract formulas, but with physical metaphors he could understand. I learned that beneath the confident, sun-kissed exterior was a current of anxiety about his future, about disappointing his parents, about life after the applause for his swimming faded. And in return, he pulled me out of my shell. He didn't just invite me to his world, he dragged me into it. He'd show up at my dorm room, smelling of victory and chlorinated water after a meet, and insist I come to the celebratory party. I hated parties. The noise, the crowds, the overwhelming pressure to be someone I wasn't. But I'd go for him. I'd stand in a corner, nursing a single drink, and watch him hold court. He was magnificent, a natural center of gravity, drawing people into his orbit with an easy laugh. And every so often, he'd glance across the room, catch my eye, and give me a small, conspiratorial smile, a silent acknowledgement that said, "I see you. Thanks for being here." It was a lifeline. It made the noise bearable. My affection for him grew in the quiet, unlit corners of my life, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. It was a slow, chemical process, invisible on the surface. It was in the way my camera naturally found him in a crowd, even when I wasn't consciously looking. I have a whole series of photos from that time, a secret collection I never showed anyone. A shot of the back of his neck, water droplets glistening on his skin after practice. A blurry image of him mid-laugh, his head thrown back, the pure, unadulterated joy of the moment captured in a soft focus blur. A candid frame of him asleep on my dorm room floor after one of those parties, his face peaceful and vulnerable, the boisterous athlete momentarily replaced by a quiet boy. I was documenting my own heartbreak, preserving the evidence of a love that could only exist in the space between the shutter's click and the final print. He was the subject I could never frame properly, the story I could never tell. He had girlfriends, of course, a series of bright, beautiful girls who seemed perfectly matched to his own radiance. They were the kind of girls who looked great in his Letterman jacket, who cheered the loudest at his meets. I was quietly, politely friendly with all of them. I learned their names, their majors, their favorite coffee orders. I became the stable, reliable friend, the one they both trusted. Julian's best friend, Leo. The quiet photographer. The safe one. It was a role I played with Oscar-worthy dedication, a performance that hollowed me out from the inside. Each time he'd gush about a new romance, My heart would perform a familiar, painful contortion, a mix of genuine happiness for him and a profound, selfish sorrow for myself. I would smile, offer advice, and then retreat to my darkroom to develop another black and white portrait of my own longing. The most serious of them was Sarah. They met senior year and stayed together after graduation. She was smart, ambitious, and she seemed to truly understand him, to see beyond the swimmer and appreciate the man. They moved in together. They got a dog. They were on that predictable, pre-approved track toward marriage and a life I could only watch from a distance. During those years, my friendship with Julian settled into a comfortable, adult rhythm. We'd meet for beers once a week. I'd go to their place for dinner. I was the designated photographer at their housewarming party. I was so deeply embedded in the fabric of their life together that the nature of my own feelings felt like a dormant volcano, dangerous but unlikely to ever erupt. I had built a life around the certainty of his unavailability. It was a painful kind of safety, but it was safety nonetheless. I had my own apartment, a small but growing freelance photography business, and a well-practiced resignation. I had accepted my place in his universe, a loyal, stationary moon orbiting a brilliant, unattainable sun. And I told myself it was enough. It had to be. Then the universe, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, decided to change the celestial map. The shift didn't begin with a bang, but with the eerie silence that follows one. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of evening where the air has a sharp, brittle edge and the city lights seem to smear against the encroaching darkness. I was in my apartment, which doubled as my studio, editing a set of corporate headshots, the work tedious but necessary. My space was my sanctuary, a converted loft with high ceilings, exposed brick, and one entire wall of windows that looked out over the quieter, less glamorous side of the city. It was a space curated for solitude, filled with books, camera equipment, and the comforting clutter of my work. The lighting was always low, the music always soft. It was a room designed to keep the world at a manageable distance. The knock on my door was so out of place it felt like a violation of a physical law. I didn't get unexpected visitors. My friends, the few I had besides Julian, knew to text first. My heart gave a little stutter of anxiety. I checked the time. 9:30. Too late for a delivery, too early for a crisis. I walked to the door, my socked feet silent on the old wooden floors, and peered through the peephole. The distorted, fisheye view showed me a familiar shape, but it was all wrong. It was Julian, but not the Julian I knew. The vibrant energy that usually radiated from him, a tangible aura of warmth and motion, was gone. He was just standing there, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He wasn't a force of nature anymore. He was just a man standing in a hallway, looking utterly and completely lost. I swung the door open. "Jules, what's wrong?" He looked up, and the sight of his face was a physical blow. His eyes, normally so bright, were dull and red-rimmed. The perpetual tan he carried from years of outdoor training seemed to have paled, leaving his skin looking sallow under the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked like a photograph that had been left in the developer for too long, the highlights blown out, the details lost in a murky gray. He didn't speak for a moment, just stared at me, his expression one of hollowed-out disbelief. "It's over," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Sarah and me. It's over." The words hung in the air between us. I should have felt a surge of something terrible, a flicker of triumphant hope. But I didn't. All I felt was a deep, aching empathy for his pain. The volcano of my own feelings was dormant, buried under the immediate, pressing need to take care of him. I saw the years of history, the shared dog, the apartment full of furniture they'd picked out together, all crumbling around him. He wasn't my unattainable crush in that moment. He was my friend, and he was drowning. "Oh, Jules," I breathed, and without thinking, I stepped forward and pulled him into a hug. He was rigid at first, a statue of misery, and then he just collapsed against me, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. I held him, my hand on the back of his head, my cheek pressed against his hair, which smelled not of chlorine but of the stale air of a house full of arguments. I stood there in my doorway, holding the broken pieces of the life I had once envied, and felt nothing but a fierce, protective urge to shield him from the world. "Can I?" he started, his voice muffled against my shoulder. but he couldn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," I said, understanding immediately. "Yeah, of course. Come in." I led him inside and closed the door, the solid click of the lock sounding like a seal being placed on a new, uncertain chapter. He didn't want to talk about it, not then. He just drifted over to my large, comfortable leather sofa, the one I'd spent a fortune on because it was the centerpiece of my quiet life, and sank into it. He curled up on his side, facing the back cushions, and pulled a throw blanket over himself. I stood there for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders, the picture of utter defeat. The golden boy was gone, and in his place was this fragile, wounded creature. I made him a cup of tea he didn't drink, and I put on some quiet music he didn't hear. I went back to my computer, pretending to work, but my focus was entirely on the sound of his breathing from the other side of the room. That was the first night. The first night of the ritual. The ritual began with the couch. For the first week, it was his undisputed territory. He'd arrive late, after I was already home, letting himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago for emergencies. This, apparently, qualified. He'd murmur a greeting, grab a pillow and the thickest blanket I owned, and install himself on the sofa. He built a nest there, a fortress of soft things to ward off the sharp edges of his new reality. I respected the boundary. I'd offer him food, which he'd mostly pick at, and we'd exist in a shared silence, the television providing a low-level distraction. It was a strange, sad cohabitation. I became an expert in the geography of his grief. I learned that the slight tremor in his hand when he reached for a glass of water meant he was replaying an argument in his head. I learned that the long, silent hours he spent staring at the ceiling were not empty, but filled with the ghosts of what-ifs and should-haves. My apartment, my meticulously controlled sanctuary of solitude, transformed. It was no longer just mine. It now held the weight of his sadness. A pair of his running shoes appeared by the door. His gym bag found a permanent home in the corner. A different shampoo, his sandalwood one, was in my shower. It sent a constant, subtle reminder of his presence. I found myself navigating my own home with a new kind of awareness, my movements softened, my voice quieter, as if he were a sleeping animal I was afraid to startle. My life began to revolve around his silent, wounded presence. I would find myself at the grocery store, buying the brand of cereal he liked, even though he rarely ate. I'd make sure the coffee maker was ready to go in the morning, just in case today was the day he decided to rejoin the world of the living. I was becoming his caretaker, a role I slipped into with an unnerving ease. It was a way to love him that was permissible, a way to be close to him that was justifiable. He needed me. It was as simple and as complicated as that. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus on the sterile perfection of corporate headshots or product photography when there was so much raw, chaotic emotion living in my living room. Instead, I found my lens turning, once again, to him. Not overtly. I didn't ask him to pose. But I'd capture the slump of his shoulders as he stared out the window, the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing around his still form on the couch. I took a picture of his hand, resting on the worn leather, his fingers curled in a loose fist, a study in contained tension. My art became an extension of my concern, a secret chronicle of his healing, or lack thereof. I was trying to find the right exposure, the right aperture to understand the landscape of his sorrow. After about 2 weeks, the pretense of the couch began to fray. He started to look more and more exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were becoming permanent fixtures. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, he spoke from his nest of blankets. His voice was thick with sleep and misery. "This couch is killing my back," he mumbled into a pillow. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. But it hung in the air between us, an implicit request. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a new threshold. The living room was one thing, a semi-public space within the privacy of my home. My bedroom was another territory entirely. It was my last bastion of solitude, the place where I didn't have to perform, where I could let the mask of the good friend slip. The centerpiece of the room was my bed, a queen-sized mattress I had bought for myself as a gift, a luxurious expanse of space that I had, until now, occupied alone. My mind raced, cataloging all the reasons to say no. It was too much. It crossed a line. It would feed the desperate, hopeful part of me that I had worked so hard to starve. But then I looked at him, at the genuine pain in his posture, at the exhaustion etched onto his face. The caretaker in me won out over the self-preservationist. The desire to ease his physical discomfort was a convenient, noble mask for the deeper, more selfish desire to have him closer. "My bed's big enough," I heard myself say, the words sounding distant, as if someone else were speaking them. "If you want, you can take the other side." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. There was a flicker of something in them, surprise, maybe relief. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice small. "I don't want to impose." "Don't be an idiot," I said, my attempt at brusque affection. "You're not imposing. Just don't snore." It was a weak joke, but it broke the tension. He gave me a small, grateful smile, the first real one I'd seen in weeks. It was like a tiny crack of light in a sky overcast with gray. That first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. I gave him a fresh t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in, and the sight of him in my clothes, which were a little too small for his athletic frame, did a strange, painful thing to my chest. We got into bed with the careful, awkward choreography of two people who were acutely aware of the unspoken rules. A rigid, invisible line was drawn down the center of the mattress. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, a chasm of a few inches separating our bodies. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, the faint scent of my soap on his skin, the warmth radiating from his body across the cold sheets. Sleep felt like an impossibility. My body was a live wire of tension, my mind a frantic cacophony of "what does this mean?" and "don't you dare move." I must have drifted off eventually, because I woke up in the deep, pre-dawn hours to a profound and terrifying change in our careful geography. Sometime in the night, the invisible wall had been breached. He had turned over, and in his sleep, he had sought out warmth. His arm was slung over my waist, his hand resting on my hip. His face was buried in the space between my shoulder blades, his breath a warm, steady puff against my back. He had pulled me slightly closer, so my back was flush against his chest. We were fitted together like two puzzle pieces. My first reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. My entire body went rigid. This was it, the point of no return. I should move. I should gently disengage, retreat to my side of the bed, and pretend this never happened. It was an accident, a trick of sleep-addled muscles. To assign it meaning would be a fool's errand. But I didn't move. After the initial shock, a second wave washed over me, something so powerful and overwhelming it almost brought tears to my eyes, a feeling of profound, earth-shattering peace. The weight of his arm was not a burden, it was an anchor. The sound of his steady breathing was a lullaby. For the first time in weeks, the frantic energy of his grief felt quieted, soothed by simple, unconscious contact. And for me, after years of pining from a safe distance, to be held by him, even accidentally, felt like coming home. I lay there, trapped and liberated all at once, and listened to him breathe until the sun came up, terrified of the dawn that would surely break the spell. The spell, however, did not break. When we woke up, he was still there, tangled up with me. He blinked himself awake, a slow process, and for a moment, his eyes were hazy with sleep. He seemed to realize our position at the same time I remembered it. I expected him to recoil, to apologize, to make a joke. I expected the awkwardness to descend like a shroud. Instead, he just mumbled a sleepy "morning," his voice thick and gravelly, and didn't move. He kept his arm around me for another full minute before finally, reluctantly, untangling himself to face the day. There was no apology, no explanation. It was a silent acknowledgement. This was the new landscape. From that night on, the invisible line in the bed ceased to exist. The pretense of separate spaces was abandoned. Sharing my bed became our new normal. And with that, the nature of the ritual shifted from proximity to contact. It started small. An accidental foot brushing against mine, a hand falling onto my arm. But it quickly escalated, driven by his deep, unconscious need for comfort. He was the initiator, always. I was the still point, the harbor he returned to each night. My role was to be present, to be solid, to absorb the overflow of his sadness and anxiety. The cuddling became the central act of our nightly routine. We'd get into bed, turn on the TV to some mindless show, and within minutes, he would gravitate toward me. He would roll onto his side, tuck himself behind me, and wrap his arms around my chest, pulling me back against him until there was no space left between us. He'd bury his face in my neck, his breath warm and steady, and his whole body would seem to sigh with relief. It was the posture of someone seeking absolute refuge. For him, I think, it was purely about solace. I was a human-shaped security blanket, a warm body to ward off the cold loneliness of his new life. He was processing his trauma not through words, but through touch, seeking a primal, nonverbal comfort that I was uniquely positioned to provide. For me, it was something else entirely. It was a nightly crucifixion and resurrection. Every evening, I was nailed to a cross of my own longing, forced to endure the exquisite agony of having the one thing I wanted most in the world, but only under a false pretense. He was holding me, yes, but was he holding me, Leo, or just an anonymous source of comfort? My body would be flooded with a cocktail of conflicting emotions, the deep, calming joy of his closeness, the sharp, painful awareness of its likely impermanence, and the crushing guilt of my own secret desires. I felt like a fraud, a thief stealing moments of intimacy that weren't rightfully mine. He was grieving, and I was what? Taking advantage of it? Or was I just being a good friend, offering the only kind of support he seemed able to accept? I became a scholar of his touch. I could differentiate between the needy, desperate grip of a bad day and the looser, more relaxed hold of a good one. I learned the rhythm of his heartbeat against my back, a steady drumbeat that I timed my own breathing to. I memorized the exact weight of his head on my shoulder, the shape of his hand on my stomach. These were the secret, sensory details that made up my new reality. My nights were spent in his arms, in a state of suspended bliss and terror, and my days were spent analyzing every minute detail, searching for meaning, for a sign that this was more than just a temporary arrangement. The dynamic bled out of the bedroom and into the rest of our lives. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I'd wake up in his arms, and we'd stumble into the kitchen together. I'd make the coffee while he showered. We'd eat breakfast in a comfortable silence. It was a pantomime of a relationship, a performance of partnership without any of the lines being spoken. Our friends, the few who saw us together during this period, were confused. We didn't define it. We couldn't. What would we say? He's staying with me while he gets over his ex, and yes, we sleep in the same bed and hold each other like shipwreck survivors. But don't worry, it's purely platonic. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. One evening, about 2 months into this new arrangement, the unspoken tension reached a new height. He had had a particularly bad day. He'd had to go back to the apartment he once shared with Sarah to pick up the last of his things. He came back to my place looking shattered, his face pale and his eyes haunted. He didn't speak a word, just dropped his keys on the counter, came into the living room where I was working, and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on the top of my head. I stopped what I was doing and just sat there, letting him hold me. We stood like that for a long time, a silent tableau of comfort and grief. Later that night, in bed, he was more desperate for contact than ever. He wasn't just holding me. He was clinging to me, his grip tight, almost frantic. His face was pressed so firmly into my neck I could feel the dampness of his tears on my skin. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand over his, a small gesture of solidarity. After a while, his breathing evened out, and I thought he had fallen asleep. His hold loosened slightly, becoming less desperate and more possessive. His hand slid from my chest down to my stomach. His fingers splayed out in a gesture of simple, declarative ownership. It felt less like he was holding on for dear life, and more like he was holding on to something that belonged to him. The thought sent a dangerous, thrilling jolt through me. And as I lay there, pinned by his weight and his sorrow, a terrifying question began to form in my mind. What happens when he doesn't need me anymore? What happens when he heals? Will he just get up and walk away, leaving me with the phantom limb of his presence and a bed that suddenly feels impossibly large and empty? The fear was a cold, sharp thing, a stark contrast to the warmth of his body wrapped around mine. The ritual that was saving him was slowly, methodically destroying me. And then came the night of the question. It was different from the start. A shift in the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable. For weeks, the ritual had been confined to the bedroom, our sanctuary of plausible deniability. The living room couch, where it had all begun, had been reclaimed as a more neutral territory. But on this particular Tuesday, the ritual migrated. We had ordered takeout, and after eating, we didn't retreat to the bedroom to watch a movie. We stayed on the couch. It felt like a regression, a return to the early days, but the dynamic was entirely different. He didn't create a nest for himself at the far end. He settled right next to me, his thigh pressed against mine, and as the opening credits of the movie rolled, he leaned his head on my shoulder, just as he did in bed. His arm came around my waist, pulling me into the familiar C-shape of our nightly embrace. The context was all wrong. Here, in the brighter, more open space of the living room, our strange intimacy felt more exposed, more deliberate. In the bedroom, in the dark, it could be explained away as a function of sleep and sorrow. Here, it felt like a choice. My mind, ever the analyst, went into overdrive. Why here? Why now? Was this an escalation? A test? Or was it simply that the boundaries had eroded so completely that the location no longer mattered? The comfort he sought from me was no longer confined to the darkness. It had bled into the light. The movie played on, a series of predictable car chases and hollow threats, but I wasn't watching. I was cataloging the sensory data, the precise pressure of his head on my collarbone, the way his thumb was drawing small, absent-minded circles on my hip, a tiny, repetitive motion that was sending shockwaves through my entire system. The air grew thick, charged with a new kind of electricity. It wasn't just the familiar hum of my unspoken affection and his unspoken grief. There was a third element now, a current of intention flowing from him. I could feel it in the way his breathing deepened, in the subtle increase in the pressure of his arm around me. He was no longer just passively receiving comfort. He was actively participating in the closeness. The silence between the explosions on the screen stretched, becoming more meaningful than any dialogue. He was building up to something. I could feel the change in barometric pressure that precedes a storm. My own body was a landscape of tension, every muscle coiled, waiting for the lightning to strike. He shifted, not away, but closer, nuzzling his face into my neck. The gesture was so intimate, so proprietary, it stole the breath from my lungs. It was the kind of casual affection reserved for lovers, a gesture he had never made before, not even in the deepest throes of our nightly ritual. This was new territory. This was a deliberate step across a previously unacknowledged line. Leo, his voice was a murmur against my skin, vibrating through me. I managed a non-committal hum, my throat too tight for words. My heart was a frantic drum solo against the quiet bass line of the movie's score. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the entire history of our friendship, the weight of every unspoken word, every secret photograph, every night spent in that agonizingly chaste embrace. I felt the risk and the hope and the terror all coiling into a single, unbearable point of pressure in my chest. This was the precipice. And then he asked it. What would you do if I kissed you right now? The world stopped. The movie, the city outside my window, the very passage of time, it all froze. There was only the dim light of the television, the warmth of his body, and the echo of his question in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. It was a loaded question, a key that could unlock one of two doors. Behind door number one was the safe answer, the one that would preserve our friendship at the cost of my soul. A laugh, a joke, a deflection. I'd probably be very confused. Dude, it would break the spell, release the tension, and send us back to our familiar, painful corners. Behind door number two was the truth. The terrifying, liberating, world-altering truth. That door led to a landscape I had only ever visited in my dreams, a place where I didn't have to hide, a place where my love wasn't a secret, shameful thing. But opening it could also lead to ruin. It could shatter the most important relationship in my life. I thought about the past few months. I thought about him on my doorstep, broken. I thought about the invisible line in my bed. I thought about the feeling of his arm around me in the dark, an anchor in the night. I thought about the circles he was drawing on my hip. He had been the one to cross every line. He had been the one to come to my door, to get into my bed, to reach for me in his sleep. He had been the one to blur every boundary until our lives were hopelessly entangled. He had knocked on the door. It was my turn to decide whether to open it. I took a breath, the first full, real breath I'd taken in years, it felt like. I turned my head slightly, just enough so that my lips brushed against his hair. My voice, when it came, was steady, devoid of panic or hesitation. It was the calmest I had ever felt. "I'd probably kiss you back." The words were out. They hung in the air, simple, honest, and irrevocable. I had opened the door. The choice was now his whether to walk through it. He went very still. The thumb on my hip stopped its circling. He pulled his head back from my neck, just enough to look at me. His eyes, in the flickering blue light from the screen, were wide and searching. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't laughing. He was just looking at me, his expression one of intense, sober consideration, as if he were seeing me for the very first time. He was looking at me, Leo, not the caretaker, not the human security blanket, but the person who had just confessed, in a handful of words, the entire secret history of his heart. Then, he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't a nod of agreement. It was a nod of understanding, of confirmation. It said, "Okay, I see." He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to turn away, to retreat, to close the door I had just opened. My gaze dropped from his eyes to his lips. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stayed right where I was, a willing participant in the beautiful, terrifying gravity of the moment. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was questioning. It was soft and unbelievably gentle, a bare whisper of contact. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It tasted of salt from the popcorn and the faint, sweet trace of the iced tea we'd been drinking. But underneath it all, it tasted of him. It tasted like an overdue homecoming. My eyes fluttered shut, and I met his gentleness with my own, a silent answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. I kissed him back. And in the quiet of my apartment, with the sounds of fake explosions in the background, a new world was being created, born from a single, whispered question and a single, honest answer. The aftermath was not the explosion of joy I might have fantasized about in my more foolish moments. It was silence, a profound, heavy, and deeply awkward silence that settled over us the moment our lips parted. The kiss had been a lightning strike, illuminating everything for one brilliant, terrifying second. Now, we were left in the disorienting darkness that followed, with the smell of ozone in the air. Julian pulled back completely, disentangling himself from me and shifting to the far end of the sofa. He had crossed the vast expanse of the couch to kiss me, and now he retreated back across it, creating a chasm of leather and silence between us. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the television screen, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. I'm tired," he finally mumbled, his voice strained and unrecognizable. "I'm gonna head to bed." He stood up without waiting for a response and walked out of the living room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't go into my bedroom. I heard the door to the small, spare room I used for storage click open, and then shut. The room with the lumpy old futon I hadn't offered him since the first week. The message was clear. He had not just retreated to the other end of the couch. He had retreated back to the very beginning of the ritual, to a time before the lines had blurred, before the bed had been shared. He had hit a rewind button I didn't know existed. I sat there on the couch, alone, the warmth of his body rapidly fading from the cushion next to me. The phantom pressure of his lips was still on mine. My heart, which had been soaring moments before, was now a lead weight in my chest. I had misinterpreted everything. The question, the kiss, it hadn't been a beginning. It had been a mistake. A moment of grief-induced confusion on his part, a fantasy-fueled miscalculation on mine. He hadn't been knocking on my door. He had just been rattling the handle, and when I'd swung it open, he had been terrified by what he saw inside. The quiet devastation was absolute. I had gambled the safety of our friendship on a single moment of hope, and I had lost. The silence from the spare room was louder than any argument. It was the sound of a wall being built, brick by painful brick. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. A single, hastily scrawled note was on the kitchen counter. Had to get to the gym early. See you later. There was no mention of the night before. It was a deliberate, brutal erasure. A few hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from him. My heart leaped with a pathetic, treacherous hope before I even read it. "Hey, sorry, last night was weird. I'm just messed up right now. Let's just forget it happened." Weird. He had taken the most significant moment of my adult life. A moment of earth-shattering vulnerability and hope, and he had dismissed it with the most banal, insulting word in the English language. Let's just forget it happened. He wanted to take the one truth I had ever dared to speak aloud and bury it. The devastation I had felt the night before began to curdle, solidifying into something harder and colder. It was hurt, yes, but it was also anger. A quiet, slow-burning anger. Anger at him, for his cowardice, for treating my heart like a temporary refuge he could abandon when it became inconvenient. And anger at myself, for allowing my hope to make me so vulnerable. He didn't come back that night, or the next. He sent a few stilted, functional texts. Grabbing my gym bag. Won't be late. Hope you're having a good week. He was treating me like a casual acquaintance, a roommate he was trying to avoid. My apartment, which had been a haven of shared warmth for months, suddenly felt cavernous and cold. Every empty space screamed his absence. The dent in the sofa cushion, the other side of my bed, the hook where his jacket used to hang, they were all monuments to my own stupidity. The silence was no longer comfortable or companionable. It was a suffocating void. For 3 days, I let him run. I let him hide. I let myself spiral, replaying the kiss, his question, his retreat, over and over again, the footage grainy and painful in the darkroom of my mind. I tortured myself with alternate scenarios. What if I had laughed it off? What if I had just stayed silent? We would still have the ritual. We would still have the closeness, even if it was a lie. At least it was a warm lie. Now, all I had was the cold, hard truth of his rejection. But on the 4th day, something shifted. The anger, which had been a low simmer, finally came to a boil. This wasn't just about my unrequited feelings anymore. This was about respect. For months, I had been his anchor, his safe harbor. I had held him, literally and figuratively, while he fell apart. I had given him a home when his own had crumbled. I had absorbed his pain without complaint. And his response, upon glimpsing a fraction of my own vulnerability, was to run and hide and call it weird? No, I deserved more than that. Our friendship, the real, deep, foundational friendship that existed long before Sarah, and the couch, and the kissing, deserved more than that. He didn't get to detonate our world, and then pretend the debris didn't exist. My fingers moved over my phone, my resolve hardening with every letter I typed. There was no hesitation this time. We need to talk. My place. Tonight. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The 3 little dots that appeared under his name felt like an eternity. Then, a simple reply. Okay. He arrived at 8. When I opened the door, he looked like a stranger. He stood in the hallway, his hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. The easy, comfortable energy he used to carry was replaced by a tense, guarded stillness. He looked like a defendant arriving for his sentencing. Hey, he said, his voice quiet. Come in, I said, my own voice flat and even. I had spent the afternoon preparing for this, steeling myself, marshaling my thoughts. I would not be emotional. I would not be accusatory. I would be a photographer. I would present the evidence, the facts, the images as I had captured them, and I would demand that he look at them. He walked in and stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, not daring to sit on the couch that had become a crime scene. I didn't sit either. I stood by the window, putting the width of the room between us, and turned to face him. I'm not going to forget it happened, Julian. I began, my voice calm measured. And I'm not going to let you pretend it was weird, so we're going to talk about it. And you're going to be honest with me. For once. He flinched at that, but he didn't protest. He just nodded, his eyes still glued to a spot on the floor. For 3 months, I continued, my voice gaining strength, you have lived in my home. You showed up on my doorstep, and I let you in. You slept on my couch, and I let you stay. You were miserable on the couch, so I invited you into my bed. You were cold, so I let you hold me. Night after night, you have used me as your anchor, your furnace, your goddamn teddy bear. And I let you. I did it because you're my best friend, and you were in pain. I never asked for anything. I never pushed for anything. I just let you take the comfort you needed. I paused, letting the words sink in. He finally looked up at me, his face a mask of misery. Every single line that has been crossed between us, you were the one who crossed it first. Every single one. And then you asked me that question. You asked me what I would do. You opened that door, Julian. Not me. And when I gave you an honest answer, the only honest answer I could possibly give, You kissed me. And now you want to call it weird and run away? You don't get to do that. You don't get to use me up and then discard me because you got scared. I am not a temporary fix for your loneliness. I am a person, and you owe me the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. I had laid it all out, the entire sequence of events, the undeniable facts. I had developed the film and hung the prints in the air between us. He couldn't look away from them. He finally sank onto the edge of the sofa, his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders started to shake. It wasn't the dramatic sobbing of that first night. It was a quiet, defeated tremor. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered into his hands, his voice thick with shame. I know you're right. I'm sorry. I don't want you to be sorry," I said, my voice softening slightly. The anger was dissipating, leaving only a vast, aching sadness. "I want you to be honest. Why? Why did you kiss me if you were just going to run?" He took a long, shuddering breath and finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, but he met my gaze. "Because I was scared," he said, his voice raw. "Because kissing you, it wasn't weird." That was a lie. It was the least weird thing that's happened in the last year. It felt right. It felt more right than anything with Sarah felt for a long, long time. And that's what terrified me. He stood up and started pacing, the kinetic energy returning to him. But this time it was born of anxiety, not confidence. "I came here because I was broken. My whole life, the one I thought I was supposed to have, it was gone. And you were just so quiet and calm and safe. Being here, with you, it was the only time the noise in my head stopped. And at night, holding on to you, it felt like the only solid thing in the whole world." He stopped in front of me, his expression pleading. I thought I just needed a friend. I told myself that every single night. Leo's just being a good friend, but it was a lie. I was lying to myself. Because somewhere along the way, it stopped being about Sarah. It stopped being about the breakup. It started being about you. About wanting to be close to you. And I didn't know what to do with that. It didn't fit any of the boxes in my head. And when I kissed you, and you kissed me back, it was like all the boxes just shattered. And all I could feel was panic. Panic that I was going to ruin the one good thing I had left. You. Our friendship. Panic that I didn't know who I was anymore. So I ran. It was a cowardly, shitty thing to do. And I'm so sorry. He had finally said it. The truth. It wasn't the romantic confession of my daydreams, but it was something far more valuable. It was real. It was messy and complicated and drenched in fear and confusion, but it was the truth. He hadn't been using me, not intentionally. He had been just as lost and confused by the shifting landscape as I was. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. The tension in my shoulders, a tension I had been carrying for 4 days, for months, for years, finally began to release. The anger was gone. The hurt was still there, a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a wave of profound, heartbreaking empathy. We were just two people, fumbling in the dark, trying to find our way. I closed the distance between us and gently took his hand. His fingers were cold. "You're an idiot," I said, but there was no heat in it. Only a weary affection. A tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. "I know. So what now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A fragile, uncertain hope flickered in his eyes. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want to run anymore. Can we just start from here? From the truth." The truth. It was a terrifying and exhilarating place to start, but it was solid ground. It was a foundation. I gave his hand a squeeze, a silent affirmation. We didn't have a map for this new territory. We had no idea where we were going. But for the first time, it felt like we were finally heading in the same direction. There was no grand resolution that night, no passionate embrace to seal our new, undefined pact. The confession had left us both raw and exposed, like patients after a long and difficult surgery. We were exhausted. After his confession, a new kind of quiet settled between us, different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't the comfortable silence of old friendship, nor the charged silence of unspoken desire, nor the hostile silence of our recent conflict. It was a fragile, tentative peace, the quiet of a landscape after a storm has passed, the air clean and everything strangely still. We didn't know what to do with our hands, with our bodies. The old ritual was broken, its pretense shattered. A new one had not yet been created. So we did the most mundane thing possible. I made tea, 2 mugs of chamomile, the steam rising in comforting plumes in the cool air of the apartment. We sat on the couch, but not like before. We sat at opposite ends, a deliberate, respectful distance between us. It wasn't a chasm of rejection anymore. It was a space for breathing. It was an acknowledgement that we couldn't just fall back into the old patterns. The couch was no longer a stage for our drama. It was just a piece of furniture. We drank our tea and talked, not about us, but about small things. His training, a photography project I was bidding on. The weather. It was the careful, delicate work of rebuilding, laying a new foundation one small, ordinary brick at a time. When the tea was gone and the yawns began, the final, unspoken question of the night loomed. Where would we sleep? The spare room futon? The couch? My bed? Each option was loaded with meaning. He looked at me, his eyes full of uncertainty. The confident, charismatic swimmer was gone, replaced by this hesitant, vulnerable man who was afraid to make a wrong move. I was the one who made the choice. Come on, I said softly, standing up and taking his empty mug. It's late. I led the way to my bedroom. I didn't say, you can have the bed, or, I'll take the floor. I just pulled back the covers on both sides. It was an invitation without pressure, a statement of fact. This is our room. This is our bed. He watched me, his expression unreadable, and then he slowly, deliberately, walked to the other side of the bed. We undressed in a new, shy silence, acutely aware of each other. We got under the covers, and for the first time in months, we lay on our backs, inches apart, not touching. The air was still thick with the memory of what this bed had been, a place of feigned sleep and unconscious comfort, and the awareness of what it was now, a place of intentional, conscious choice. I switched off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the sliver of city glow under the curtains. For a long time, there was only the sound of our breathing, 2 separate rhythms in the dark. I thought this would be the new normal, a respectful distance, a careful separation. But then, I felt a subtle shift in the mattress, a hesitant warmth reaching across the small space between us. His fingers brushed against mine, a tentative question. I didn't hesitate. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers with his. His grip was firm, a silent, grateful response. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We just lay there, holding hands in the dark, and for the first time, everything felt simple. There were no more lies, no more pretenses, no more rituals built on a foundation of plausible deniability. There was just this, the solid, real warmth of his hand in mine. It wasn't the frantic, desperate clinging of his grief, nor the possessive hold of unconscious desire. It was a quiet, equal partnership, a choice freely made in the wake of a hard-won truth. Sleep came easily that night, a deep and dreamless peace that felt like a benediction. In the end, the most profound changes don't happen in the moments of grand confession, but in the quiet, ordinary mornings that follow. Waking up, not tangled together out of habit or need, but simply facing each other on our pillows, his hand still loosely holding mine. The way he smiled, a real, unburdened smile, the first I'd seen in what felt like a lifetime. The way we made coffee together, a shared, easy dance in the small kitchen, our bodies no longer magnets of unspoken tension, but simply 2 objects moving in a comfortable, shared space. We were learning a new language, one spoken not in loaded questions or desperate embraces, but in small, deliberate acts of care. A hand on the small of my back as I reached for a mug. A shared look across the breakfast table. The simple, profound act of closing the bedroom door, not to hide, but to create a space that was ours and ours alone. The healing wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a slow, patient process, like an image emerging in a developing tray, gradually gaining clarity and depth. We began to heal, not just him from his past, but both of us, from our loneliness. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.